The new executive order on AI is making headlines not because it starts something new, but because it signals where things are headed. You often don't need to wait for policy to tell you that this matters. It's already shaping the systems we'll live, learn, and lead in. Designing the future isn't something we should be waiting for, it's something we choose. Whether we shape the systems ourselves or let others decide for us, the outcome is a choice. And when it comes to AI, policy isn't just policy, it's infrastructure, it's architecture, and the foundation of the world we're building.
How do you navigate change? It's a question we think about often, and one that today's world expects us to be comfortable with. The challenge, however, is where do you begin? And how do you develop the mindset and skills to be successful? You're listening to Designing Schools, and I'm your host, Dr. Sabba Quidwai, educator, researcher, and storyteller. Join me each week for stories and strategies that bridge the gap between research and practice, as together we explore how might we design schools.
We're going to start today's episode by talking about something you've probably seen on all your feeds, and that is the executive order on AI and many others as well. And I want to read you an excerpt from the opening. The United States, it says, has long been at the forefront of artificial intelligence. Innovation driven by the strength of our free markets, world-class research institutions, and entrepreneurial spirit. To maintain this leadership, we must develop AI systems that are free from ideological bias or engineered social agendas. With the right government policies, we can solidify our position as the global leader in AI and secure a brighter future for all Americans. This order revokes certain existing AI policies and directives that act as barriers to American AI innovation, clearing a path for the United States to act decisively to retain global leadership in artificial intelligence. Stefan, there was a lot to unpack between all of the executive orders. You are the master of not just reading, but synthesizing. What are some of the things that are important for us to know, and what are the different ones that came out?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to start with is there are actually 7 executive orders related to education that were released. 4 of them were really about AI and education as it affects teaching and learning, all the way from we have the K-12 executive order, we have the university one, they're also related to accreditation. We have the workforce programs. So those are in there. And then we have 3 other executive orders. One's about foreign influence. Universities have to report if they get more than $250,000 from another country. And we should talk about these some other time. We won't have time today. But when you reference in your intro there a little bit, when you read it, more about like meritocracy, right? Less kind of concern for how these impact specific groups. Basically, they're trying to get rid of what they call disparate impact analysis, but it's just a legal concept about if a type of a policy has a disproportionate impact on a group, any type of minority, really, and they want to get rid of that. And we can talk about that another day. But I want to talk today about the executive orders as they relate to education and AI. And before I do that, I just want to talk briefly about what an executive order is, because obviously you see the Trump administration has been issuing a lot of executive orders. And I find sometimes people don't really understand an executive order. It's a legally binding document, but it has limitations. In America, other people listening overseas, we have our 3 branches of government. We have the legislature, the Congress, which makes the law. We have the executive, which kind of interprets that law and then executes it. And one of the things it does, ways of, I should say, of doing that is through executive orders. And then, of course, you have the courts to say, is the executive acting within their authority as defined by the Constitution and defined by the laws, which is subject to interpretation. So when the administration issued these executive orders, which I think are all along the lines of you're encouraging schools to adopt AI, encouraging training, we can talk about some of these things, but they only have so much force, right? Because the president can reallocate some money and those types of things, but they can't really fund it directly. But I'll say that there's 3 things I think are important. One is that it puts attention on the issue. Everybody's talking about that. Whenever the president issues executive order, it's important. Second, the president does have authority within the amount of money that Congress allocates within certain programs to reallocate it or interpret how it should be spent. So one of the executive orders in the K-12, it says identify any federal funding mechanisms, including discretionary grants, that can be used to provide resources for K-12 AI education. To the extent practical and consistent with the applicable law, agencies shall prioritize funding such purposes when it would further the aims for the program for which the funding is available. So what you're saying is, all right, look at federal education law where Congress has allocated some money. What are the goals of that law? So can we use some of that money to implement an AI program? So it's not just like, here's $10 billion for AI, but executive orders are binding on the executive branch. And what he's doing is he's directing those officials to look in these other laws and these resource allocations to free up some resources. And then, of course, it tries to condition. If you don't do like we say, then, maybe we'll take your money away. That's more for some of the DEI type programs. It is a lot of positive movement in a direction, and it starts to set some priorities. And of course, Congress could include things in its budget, but that's where we're headed. So I think some of the orders, as I was saying initially, really affect everything. I'll say K-12 or preschool, right? All the way through high school, 12th grade, that's one executive order. Then you have some stuff about a university, which is relevant. But if you look at the K-12, there's the most direct kind of references to supporting AI. What they want is they want training for students and staff. And they're not real specific, but they want to have some kind of basic type of AI literacy where the staff, including the teachers, the professionals, the leadership, all understands AI and maybe what role it plays in society. The definition of AI literacy is a bit debatable. They want to have a competition to encourage kids to maybe make an AI project in an international competition. It does encourage districts to work with companies and nonprofits to use some AI tutors, and it supports apprenticeships. And there's more of that in one of the other executive orders. And to come back to the funding where I talked about how they try to use some of the funding, it says federal grants, e.g. Title II of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, will prioritize AI training for teachers, both to integrate AI to all subjects and to teach AI-specific content. I laughed. I was like, maybe they stole my idea from the Innovation Academy, but I think because they want to integrate it into all subjects, which I think is important. We could talk more about this later. AI, it can't just be computer science class. There's still way too many schools still looking at this and just saying this is computer science class, or AI is going to impact the whole world. And you want to start teaching it in every subject, like I suggest, in the AI Innovation Academy. These are similar moves we've seen in China. They have a similar kind of order.
And
It's a
Dubai
little,
too, right? Like when
yeah,
I was
Dubai.
like,
I
it
put
sounds like you were
Indonesia
just
in
like
my
setting
notes.
Dubai.
Yeah, South Korea. We see that. The one other thing I thought about, just one point I want to make on the K-12 one, is it says it encourages critical thinking. And I was happy that it encourages critical thinking, that they recognize it's part of AI, not just the technology. But I thought it was sad that the government had to write an executive order, or this school should encourage critical thinking. To me, that's obvious, but I guess it's not obvious to everybody, and they thought they needed. So I want to talk about two other executive orders today because I think they're related to one another. The next one's about universities, and this really focuses on the accreditation process. And Trump's kind of been threatening universities lately to take away their money for this. So some people really read this that be afraid, oh my gosh, now we're going to lose our accreditation. And accreditation is the process through which the government says you're legitimate. And this is really important because if the government says you're legitimate, then your students can get federally backed student loans. Your students can do federal work study programs. So if your university is accredited, you're going to have a lot more problems than maybe losing some money the government gives you for research. Now, what they're really trying to do, it appears, if you read this, okay, is to open it up for the kind of new forms of new ways of ideas behind accreditation. So traditionally, when an accreditor looks at you, they're say, okay, do you have some majors, teach like a qualified curriculum? Are your professors qualified? And there's very little, are you financially solvent? Most accreditation gets renewed unless there's kind of financial problems, but there's not really a focus on outcomes, meaning they don't really go and look and say, when your students graduate, they're able to get a job or all these kind of things. And what this does, there's two focuses of the order. First of all, it's possible there could be some new ways, new things that are get accredited. So that there could be new accrediting bodies that are essentially certified by the federal government, and they might accredit different things. So the first thing I thought, of course, a little bit, I sent a blog quickly about this, was AI. Maybe they'll accredit AI teachers, right? Which kind of got everybody talking. But the second thing, stuff we talk about all the time, is competency-based education, We talk about like the soft skills as we define in different ways. Maybe we could talk about like entrepreneurship programs, interdisciplinary approaches, apprenticeship programs. You could have alternative accrediting bodies accredit those types of things and really start to focus universities a little bit more on the practice and the outcomes. And it says that right in the executive order that they want to start looking at outcomes, because one thing I think the Biden student loan forgiveness highlighted this. I verified the statistic again. There's 1.7 trillion in student loan debt. So we have students taking on a lot of loans to finish degrees. They have maybe $100,000 in debt, and their degree doesn't really pay that much. And it does cite some statistics in the executive orders. It cites them as if there are facts, like 40% of degrees don't have return on investment. I don't want to spend all the time today. Maybe we could talk about it later or some other time. These are debatable, right? It's hard to measure exactly what the return of investment is on a degree. But basically, I don't think there's a lot of point into getting into the minutiae of that. But I think the reality is a lot of people are earning degrees that don't have much economic return. They get stuck in a lifetime, in some cases, of debt. And the best way to manage this, or to think about it is, okay, let's certify some competencies that we always talk about that industry wants. AI literacy, I should have mentioned that. They talk about that as a competency and all these other skills. So that's another subject of an executive order. And then the third one I want to talk about is that there's one that deals with programs for getting students right into the workforce, that they want to work with schools, right? Job training, I think they call it CTE programs. The students can go right from high school and right into the workforce. So there's an emphasis on that, including AI. So it says that, so the EO, it's called the Executive Order on Trade Jobs, and it says, my administration will consolidate and streamline fragmented federal workforce development programs. They're too disconnected from propelling workers into secure, well-paying, high-need American jobs. The last sentence I'll quote, it says, opportunities to invest in the upskilling of incumbent workers to meet rapidly evolving demands of their industries, including the use of artificial intelligence in the workplace, which I know we're going to talk about later in the podcast. And then I think these executive orders, that you can think of them as a continuum, right? There's K-12, there's college, right? There's CTE. So either K-12 to university or K-12 into the workforce. And obviously there could be some overlap, but it's focused on reimagining some of those resources and standards and applications, so the students can be prepared, not just for an AI, but to have an economically more stable life.
Absolutely. And I think that's the goal of this. I think people have a lot of mixed emotions over all of these different things. But I did want to ask you two questions, because I did see these two things come up a lot. The first one was, how is this happening if he dissolved the Department of Education? And I think one thing to know is, and I could be wrong, but he didn't dissolve the Department of Education completely, reduced it significantly based on is happening across many departments. So one was, especially people were saying the Office of Education Technology, which I think we talked about a long time ago.
Right.
So that was one that came up that people had questions about. And the other big one that people had questions about was like, how are we defining AI literacy? What do they actually mean by these things? So those were two I was curious to get your thoughts on.
I think the second one's a little easier to answer, right? I don't know if we're in a state, and we both do work in this area, where there's an agreed upon definition of AI literacy. Some people have a definition that they're really focused on, that they promote, which is fine, but I don't think there's universal definition. So I think, and I alluded to this earlier, you talk to students about how AI works. If you give them a chance to use it, I think the next level is to talk about the broader societal implications. That's really important to me, right? To say, okay, if you learn how to use an AI tool, but you don't use it for something, for a job that's not going to exist, or in a way that's unhealthy for you personally, maybe using a chatbot in an unhealthy way, or in a way that centralizes power and but the more authoritarian way, that's problematic. So I think that discussion should be broader, but I don't know too, especially that we want the federal government at this point to impose a definition of AI literacy, especially because they want the schools to work with nonprofits and companies. So if a school says, and some schools don't know, right? So the school might bring in a different consultant provider of services and contract with them. And of course, we all have slightly different interpretations of this, and I think that's fine, right? I think at this point, let like a reasonable flower bloom. I don't think we want a deadly flower to bloom, but I think the fact that they haven't really defined it is okay. And I think that people at least know that includes explaining what AI is, which is a starting point. I think the second thing about the Department of Education, look, it's a little more valid of a criticism. Like to me, it's you brought up, you said, okay, first of all, they haven't abolished it. Yeah, you're right. But I think the problem is right now, there's so much confusion as to what is going on. Okay, it still exists. What parts of it still exist? They are saying they do want to shut it down. At least that's their goal, whether they succeed in doing that or not. If they shut it down, who's going to kind of, because one of the things in the executive order is, well, help schools find grants and funding. Okay, but who's going to help them with that? The Department of Education doesn't exist. There is a panel, like they have panels of people from all these other government agencies involved, but it seems more figureheady, right? Oh, because it affects all of society, we're going to bring in all these people. It does seem that is going to be a struggle. I'm sure schools feel a little bit right now. First of all, they're like, what does this mean? Okay, I'm supposed to do some stuff with AI literacy and the government will help me get a grant or something. And I'm saying it's not a legislatively appropriated program. If you look at the executive orders, in terms of promoting AI literacy, there doesn't seem to be anything really problematic about it. We can debate about the legality of this DEI stuff. There's just a court decision about it. Just the idea of facilitating AI literacy with resources that could be allocated under the law to those types of things and encouraging the development of these programs, that all seems fine. It's just schools aren't in any way compelled to do this. I think that probably would be outside. Some people say, oh, there's this mandate. It's not a mandate that you have to teach AI literacy. That's beyond the purview of the federal government, and they haven't conditioned any funding and said, oh, if you don't teach AI literacy, you're not going to get your money. That's not in the executive order. So that's not even there. So I do, these implementation questions are real. Andrew Maynard wrote a blog. He's a professor and become prominent in the space, comparing the U.S. initiative to the China initiative. And in both cases, describing, okay, this is what the federal government in the U.S. wants. Here's this executive order. And the same thing is happening in China. It's a little more of a directive from the government, but I know for a fact the schools, they don't have, every school is supposed to have some AI literacy and teach like so many hours of AI. I know for a fact, because I've done some work for a company over there, that the schools don't have enough teachers to teach this. So they're struggling on the implementation as well, but you got to start somewhere. And I think it highlights the issue.
Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to share actually an excerpt from a book. 2 days ago, Click is a book that came out, and the authors are Jake Knapp and John Zaratsky. And they are the same authors of the Design Sprint, which, talk about all over here. And the Design Sprint is really probably one of the most powerful methods for being able to approach these topics, because when you have something like artificial intelligence, that model of we're going to spend 6 months to a year coming up with a plan. We see a lot of people spend this much time on these learner profiles and all these things. And it's not to say they're not important, but we are living in a different world where everything now needs to be questioned. And what people did 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago can't be your starting point today and the same timeline. And so they have this, I wanted to read this excerpt from the opening of their book, because I think this is the message that we all collectively need to really think about. And they're talking about, how do you approach a sprint? And Click actually is not about a design sprint. One of the reasons they wrote Click was because they said a lot of people used to come to a design sprint with a problem already in mind, but the problem wasn't always well defined. So Click is about like really defining, okay, you have something like AI. What is this going to mean for us? What is the problem we're really trying to solve? Where do we want to focus? But more importantly, what I love about this particular exercise and workshop is you leave with one statement. And that one statement is what you use to advocate for why you are doing this work. So I wanted to just read this little excerpt. It says, one of the things that's important is to drop everything and sprint on the most important challenge until it's done. And I think we can collectively agree AI would fall into that category. So they said, Jay-Z and I have led sprints for hundreds of teams, and each time we clear the calendar and focus on the most important challenge and get it done. Every time it works. My God, how it works. It's fantastic. It's almost supernatural. Clearing the calendar transforms what a team can accomplish. But there's a small problem. This lesson, drop everything and sprint on the most important challenge until it's done, is easy to say, but it's not easy to do. In the modern workplace, we're supposed to attend meetings with teammates, managers, reports, business partners, and so on. We're supposed to stay on top of our email and messages. We're supposed to juggle multiple projects. And of course, we're supposed to meet deadlines and deliver results. There's a lot of supposed to. And it makes it tough to spend a full, uninterrupted day on one project, let alone two. Unfortunately, working the way we're supposed to work means giving up the big win of building the best possible product or strategy in exchange for the small wins of obliging teammates on a moment to moment basis. Replying to emails and messages instantly, going from meeting to meeting every 30 minutes. If we don't care about the big picture, then sure, keep doing what you're doing. We don't have to say no. We don't have to make tough decisions about our priorities. Everyone's happy, at least for today. But if we think we can take on ambitious projects and make them click with customers while bouncing along through business as usual, ricketing from one context to the next, we're fooling ourselves. And the reason I think that really resonated with me when I was reading the book was a lot of times when we do sit down with teams to talk about, okay, when do you want to get together? Or they've started something really important and it's great. Now, how are we going to continue to move this forward? Everybody opens up their calendars and it's, can you do this date? No, I can't do this date. Okay, next week, can you do this date? Oh no, I've got this going on. Okay, next week. And now you're into the third week from where you currently are right now. And I see this everywhere. And this is not exclusive to education, but our culture around meetings, our culture around this idea, like he said, if you just keep doing what you think you should be doing, you can be happy for the moment, but it is not going to be a sustainable approach. And I think a lot more people need to collectively look at their calendars and be, do we really need to be doing this in this moment right now over this initiative around thinking about AI or getting our teams prepared or thinking about how we might plan for the upcoming school year? And you'd be so surprised how when you make a choice in favor of yourself, your team, your organization, in favor of the future, how those outcomes, like he said, feel super natural. So I just wanted to share that right now, I think it's a really important thing. And one of my favorite examples of AI literacy, this is a paper I feel I go back to all. I haven't seen anybody come up with something better than this in terms of how might you approach AI literacy from a curricular perspective, while also not limiting yourself in terms of what you're doing. And so it was a framework, it was a paper actually that came out a while ago. It was by Dr. Kenneth Lim and his team at the Education University of Hong Kong. And they didn't just look at how do you understand how AI works, but also solve problems with it. And so one of the things that I really liked about their framework was it was a project-based approach. And their study was looking at how they did this for high school students. It didn't assume any kind of technical background, but it basically defined AI literacy as 4 dimensions. The first one was cognitive, understanding what AI is, how it works, what it cannot do, and things like that. The other one was metacognitive, being able to actually solve problems with AI, not just know about them. And that meant you had to choose the right data, you had to know what model to use, you had to know how to test and iterate and improve upon your results. And then the third one was affective. This was confidence. Do you feel capable of using AI to solve meaningful problems? So this went into like creative self-efficacy and just that belief that, yeah, I can create something new. I might not know what the answer is, that entrepreneurial spirit that you talk about a lot. And then the last domain they had was social, and this was ethics. Are students prepared to think through bias, privacy, fairness, accountability when they use AI? And when I read this paper was a really big inspiration behind the WISE framework, which we have for approaching how should I use AI and how do I make choices and make decisions. But if somebody is looking for how do we approach AI literacy, to me, these people have the best, most comprehensive social, emotional, but also technical in terms of understanding what AI is approach to AI literacy that can be integrated into any classroom.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I'd really highlight about that is when you do all the different things that you just talked about, the students have to think. Everyone say, it's going to reduce thinking. So you just keep using those assignments that you don't need to think through when you use the AI. But to do all this just stuff you talked about, the metacognitive, right, the ethical side. Now it took you through how your solution is going to work, what kind of data you need. These are the things that people are going to need to learn, and it will help them think. And I think states and companies that are starting to think about these things, these are the directions that they're finding that we need to move in.
Absolutely. And people are moving in this direction. Or one of the things that I think has really energized us is working with people to build great models. I think if there's one thing this executive order probably does, anybody who thought maybe this was optional or that, yeah, we'll do that next year, or we don't really have time for this right now, I think, like you said, it is going to put it on everyone's radar and really provoke this sense of urgency. So we have an event that's coming up in Nevada with the superintendents and their teams across the state. So on our planning call last week, they shared Nevada's AI guidance. And you did an amazing job of curating all of the different guidances and their highlights and things like that, which we can definitely link here in the doc. But I loved their guidance. And I can't say that's something I say pretty often. And so I wanted to highlight 7 elements that really stood out. And of course, we're going to link everything for you in the show notes because it wasn't just like theory or technical. It was visionary and it was really inspiring and it was just interesting to read. And I always say that's a really important criteria for a guidance. Somebody should enjoy reading it. Aesthetically, it was nice. Content wise, it was great. And it was really just an example of what happens when a state decides to really take AI seriously, not just as a new emerging technology, but really how are we building this human centered future? And so one of the things that I really liked, because I like these principles and these words or these frameworks to guide things. So their framework was called Stellar. It's an acronym and it stands for Security, Transparency, Empowerment, Learning, Leadership, Achievement, and Responsible Use. And they're not just values on paper, right? These are things to help people align. And they have this event coming up for their leadership teams across the state. This is going to be not just what they'll use, but even presenters like us will use as well. So that was the first big highlight, was just that framework that they've created and the principles that they've designed. Second, there was one line that comes up over and over again, and that's this idea that AI is a partner, not a replacement. So again, really reinforcing that confidence for anybody who might be afraid or fearful. It's simple, but I do think it's important for people to keep hearing that and for people to actually believe that as well. Third, AI literacy was not an elective. It was treated as something that should be integrated as a core part of everything kids are learning, pre-K all the way to 12. The message was super clear. Students don't just need to use AI. They need to really understand how it works, when to use it, and how to think critically about it. But again, if I'm somebody and I'm listening to that definition of AI literacy and I'm like, okay, what does that mean? How can I do this? That paper we're going to link is just gold to help you do. Number 4, they give best practices by role. So I really like this as well. Sometimes we see this in AI guidance. It's focused predominantly on just teaching and learning. This was very much a community-based approach. Educators, school leaders, parents, students, everybody had their own little part in this. And I thought that was just really nice. Number 5, they linked AI to personalized and competency-based learning. I don't have it off the top of my head, but Nevada, when they built their profile of a graduate, the one thing I do remember, because we're integrating this as part of the presentation, is a lot of it is about identity, meaning, and purpose. And it's just a really beautiful profile. So when you think about making learning personal, competency-based, and really reimagining how we think about identity, meaning, and purpose in schools, again, these kinds of things, they're just really well positioned. It's a really great model. Number 6, of course, they do the transparency, data privacy, all of those elements. And last but not least, this was not something that was written behind closed doors by a small group of people. This is something they did town halls, they had a student voice. So when they say we want a human-centered approach to AI, it wasn't just them saying it. They designed it using a human-centered lens as well. If you are looking for guidance, I always say there's a lot of people, especially when they go to conferences and they hear how a year ago we created a task force and then we did this and then we did this. And I see a lot of people in this moment saying, okay, summer 2025, we're going to create our task force and take the next year to go on that same journey that somebody in 2024, 2025 did. And I think it's really important to know, while you can have task forces, but they are going to have to do different tasks than, say, a group who were meeting last year did. I do think now it's important to get things going quicker so that you can be more prepared and really leverage the people you're bringing together for the moment that you are in.
What I really like about it, yeah, it keeps those big picture things in mind. We talked about it's part of every subject, part of every class. I was looking through as you were talking through the different parts, and I like that it's stellar. It's very empowering. And of course, the competency-based approaches, right? I like it all, but those are 2 of my favorites. And I'm glad that we have some guidance documents that are positive. I'll say you mentioned that I kind of went through a lot of them, especially early on. And I will say that a lot of the guidance is pretty much all were pretty empowering. Some of the early ones are like, even said writing detectors don't really work. Don't use them. So maybe they preferred that they did work, but they acknowledged that they did not. So I find even from the beginning that people at the C level, for the most part, who are writing the guidances, they really had a strong understanding of the kind of the technology at a conceptual level, where it was headed, what are the big picture skills that students need. Some of these that we've been talking, I say that the Army was either in 1971 or 72 initially in one of their manuals said people need soft skills and identify them. It's 50 years later, and we're even saying, let's put critical thinking, executive order to make sure schools cover it. But these kind of meta pictures, I think people have been successful in any way, professionally or life, and they look back at school, they really think, what did I get out of school? It wasn't all these things like I had to memorize. It was the competencies that I developed in the big picture approaches. And I think those are true in the world of AI. And that's how I think a place that schools can have confidence. And schools could do a little more to teach these things, but you don't need to know anything about AI to help somebody and to make choices and to develop competencies. But these can all be part of your AI strategy when somebody asks you. So I think it's a good kind of stepping stone for schools to step into this, because they do need to step into it. And then it's going to be front and center of kind of what they do for at least the next 5 years. And it's always going to be a part of who they are. It's just will become part of the normal and get absorbed into how whatever education looks like 5 to 10 years from now. But now you need to pick up your feet and step in.
Absolutely. And I think we said this, I think we talked about this the last 2 weeks as well. And that is that Google has made the AI tools free for people who have Google Education Workspace. So if your school using Google, if you've got Gmail, if you've got Docs for your organization, you should know that you also have access to Gemini 2.5 Pro, which currently is number one on leaderboard. It is the number one model out there right now with the reasoning and all the capabilities that we see in these advanced models. People have access to deep research, being able to go in and I would say deep research, honestly, deep research is the hardest one of all because there are limitless possibilities for what you can do. That I say it's having a consultant who has a PhD in every single subject matter collectively. So not like siloed subject matter PhDs people, but collectively they understand all this knowledge and can generate really great research reports for you, consolidate knowledge banks for you, which are really helpful for the next tool you have available, which is creating your own custom chatbots, which Google call custom gems. And that's been one of our favorite strategies is really using deep research to create knowledge banks and really curate a lot of content to train gems on. And if people have Notebook LM, the features, you have the best quality tools available to you for free to implement and begin doing this work. We will be hosting a webinar showing you and walking you through these features. I will put a link in the show notes for you to join the waitlist and we'll let you know when it goes live. And then, of course, Canva with all of their amazing updates. So from an adult-facing perspective with Google and Gemini, from a kid-facing perspective with Canva, you really have all your bases covered for pretty much everything you need to do this work really well. And one of the reasons I think we're starting to see a little bit more of this, I think he said it when they were doing the announcement for the executive order. And he was like, there's a lot of smart people that think this is the future. Like, we're going to go along with this. And one of the things that came out this week as well, we want to share 2 reports with you. One is from the Microsoft Work Trend Index. If you are a listener of anything that we do, that is a favorite report of ours. And I wanted to just say this because somebody commented on one of my posts and was like, you have to remember they're selling a product. And while that is true, there are a few companies that have access to really rich data simply because of how much they are used across not just industries, but age levels as well. So I would say Microsoft, Google, and Canva are 3 places that are utilized by education and enterprise across all ages. And so they just have access to some very interesting knowledge. Of course, you can always take everything with a grain of salt, as you should. But one of the things that you'll notice about the Work Trend Index is if you go back historically and you look at their last 4 or 5 reports, if you had been paying attention to those 4 or 5 reports, you'd be so well positioned for where you are today. So the Work Trend Index and, these Google reports, it's not that they're telling you this is what you should do or this is what is. They're just telling you highlights. We hear us refer to this often on the podcast, and that is these are signals that you should pay attention to. So we obviously went through the executive order, right? Lots of language about leadership, innovation. How does the US stay ahead? But obviously a policy is only as powerful as what can come next. And so we took a look at Nevada and we took a look at their policy, this idea that AI is a partner, not a replacement. And what I want to do now is go into the Microsoft Work Trend Index. So every single year, Microsoft publishes this report where they basically highlight what are some of the top 3 to 5 trends that they're seeing. They back it up with some data and just basically really great signals to begin thinking about. So one of the things that they say in their report is intelligence is now on tap, and it's going to rewrite the rules of business. And then you look at kind of things like Nevada state guidance, many of the other state guidances, and that's your thing for, okay, how do we navigate this? If intelligence is now just on tap, available to anyone, like I just said, with deep research, you've got multiple PhDs in your pocket. What is this going to mean? And one of the biggest themes from there, which again really reinforces a lot of what we've talked about on the podcast, is this idea of AI teams, right? You're going to have human workers, you're going to have digital workers, And they now say you're no longer going to have an organizational chart. They said now people are going to have work charts. And we have that graphic that we show a lot in our presentations, which is the regular organizational chart. And then on the next slide, it's like all these AIs that have come into the organization. And I think that's a pretty solid theme now, we can say. This concept of digital workers, how you're going to have human and agent teams working together is really where I think majority of people are going to be spending a lot of their focus for the last half of this year. And then the other big thing they said, which is reinforced across the LinkedIn reports that came out a couple weeks ago and many other ones, and that is AI literacy is now one of the most in demand skills. And again, I go back to people use that word a lot of hard things around that definition. That paper we're going to link for you, by far the best I have seen on this topic. But there was one line in the report that really resonated with me. And I just was like, whoa, it's interesting. They said the next promotion for a person might not be managing people, it might be managing AI agents.
Yeah, I think, and I'll reinforce when you say, okay, we're trying to sell you a product. And I looked at your highlights, pulled out, I didn't have a chance to read the report, but I would say that there's nothing here that surprises me because other people are saying this, whether they're academics or journalists. I'm not saying there's no line in here that says, if you don't use Copilot, you're going to be a failure. So they're just talking about the general trends which are consistent with what other people say. And to your point is that they've been accurate in the past. And the other thing I would add is it's about managing agents. And you say as a partner, if you bring it back to the quote you read from one of the executive orders, when we started the podcast today, it's about U.S. leadership in AI. There's basically two types of leadership, right? The development of the AI. And yeah, it seems based on what's publicly available that the U.S. is ahead. Most people say maybe 6 months or it could just disappear. In China, we came up with a transformer, which propelled these deep learning AI models, which is what we have now, right? They're all basically powered by this kind of invention. So imagine China, and some people say we're a couple major inventions away from human level intelligence. And that's true. China could have one of those inventions and they could propel ahead. Other people say, okay, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's basically what they have is good enough. I won't go on and on about that, but my point is that where the question comes now, we already have a lot of AI. It's everywhere. It's really only the most advanced companies that are using the advanced things right now. It's how you're going to implement the AI. Is actually how you're going to get this AI like into your society. How are you going to get your companies using it? How are students going to use it to learn more? How are teachers going to use it? How are we going to use it in factories to produce goods, to be more efficient, to enhance our economic competitiveness? How are we going to deploy it into the military? And this is starting to become a theme. There's a lot of really good debaters. Two of them, the one won the college national debate tournament, was a very good debater years ago. And they wrote an article in Foreign Affairs about how the question now is, how do we implement U.S. society? There's a professor, George Washington, who won a high school national championship. Jeffrey Ding, who wrote a book called Technology and the Rise of Great Powers. And a lot of people are making this diffusion argument. Actually, I had somebody connect with me on LinkedIn, and he said he works in the Department of Defense on competing with China and AI. His wife getting her EdD in innovation and education, and her focus is on AI. And he said he liked reading my Substack because I talk about the intersection of AI and national security. I'm like, Harry, you should go read these books and read these articles. And he didn't know about them. So I was like, well, wow. Okay. But I think that a big part of the question is how do you put this in, whether your focus is national security, economic competitiveness, if you're just someone who wants to make sure you have a job or you can start a business, wherever you are, the questions about our implementation, right? The question literally of who's ahead of the margins is an academic question for most people. It's interesting, but it's hard to evaluate. It's not really clear. There's gains and losses right across the spectrum. So it's really these things, and it's going to depend on what people are doing at the school level, where they're following through on some of the ideas in the executive order, following this Nevada guidance or other guidances, parents making choices for their kids about what kind of programs they're going to be in or what kids are going to go to college. All these things, that's what really going to determine the health of our society, not whether what OpenAI like 4.9 or like 5.1 does at this point. And it's not going to matter if we don't or aren't able to diffuse these technologies throughout our society because everyone's still reading Macbeth.
Absolutely. And one of the other reasons I think this has really come to the forefront for a lot of people is there's ROI now. there's a lot of examples of people, whether it's building companies, whether it's in workplaces. And the one big differentiator, I always think this reminds me of the social media type thing. There's people who are benefiting and seeing the benefits, and there's people who don't at all. And I always go back to the number one difference between those two groups of people is one of them use that first principles mindset to be able to rethink how they're doing things. And the other one just took a substitution approach. And so the next report we wanted to share with you is from Google, and it was all about the ROI. They called it the ROI of Gen AI. And it's a really fantastic report. It's basically a global survey of enterprise adoption and the value that people have gotten. And so I just want to share just a couple of highlights from here. They said that 84% of companies can move a generative AI use case from idea to production in under 6 months. Not years, not like someday maybe this will happen, but within 6 months. And if you remember earlier in the episode when I talked about Click, and I shared with you, they were the authors of the design sprint methodology, which teaches you how to quickly iterate and go through the use cases. And I have an idea, but how are we going to test it, get the data to see if it's worth spending our time on? It came from Google. And so it's so funny to me always how Chromebooks in every classroom, Google as an ecosystem is one of the top used ed tech applications, yet the actual strategies for innovation have barely made it into the education system at all. And so if you are somebody who's interested in learning about the design sprint, definitely send us a message so we can share more about how it works and how you can utilize it in your organization. All right, a couple other things they said in the report, 74% of those companies are seeing ROI within the first year. And again, I think having metrics and having a way to be able to even calculate this for yourself is really important. 86% we're seeing a measurable lift in revenue, and organizations with strong leadership buy-in were seeing the biggest gains from everyone. So this whole report was a lot more about this isn't just, oh, go get an AI tool. It was, again, really reinforcing that theme. This is about redesigning how we work, how we lead, and how we learn. One of the stats that I thought was wild, they said 45% of companies said productivity had doubled, not just a little incremental 1 hour a week saving. It had doubled because of generative AI. And that's a big shift to make, which is going to impact hiring. And again, we think about education. This is what's happening in enterprise today. You think about a first grader, fifth grader, 10th grader. We need to change what we are doing with those kids in classes. The organizations, they said, that saw the most impact, they were not the ones that waited for the perfect roadmap. They were the ones who basically got their leadership teams together, created alignment, invested in people and their learning, got really clear on what AI literacy meant for their context. And so when they were talking about AI readiness, they weren't just talking about it, like I said, from a technology perspective, they were talking about it from a capacity building perspective. And this really brings us really beautifully full circle back to the beginning. And that is that we don't have to wait for these executive orders. We don't have to wait for other people to tell us how we should do things, because most people don't like that, right? Most people don't like when somebody comes along and says, okay, this is the rule now, and this is how we're all going to do this, and this is what it's going to look like. The beauty, the advantage, and the opportunity is to understand the signals, the ones that hopefully we help in bringing to you every single week on the podcast, and being, if these are the signals that I see and this is where things are going, what are we going to do proactively in our community with our team to be able to design what's next so that it's in your control and not at the directive of someone else.
You get to do it my way. You the Frank Sinatra song, okay? Rather than your way.
Or
How far? So that, yeah, that's the advantage of leading, right?
I know what we're singing.
No more singing. I'm actually tone deaf. I shouldn't do it anymore. I was in sixth grade. Basically, anyone could be on the chorus, and I didn't make it. And then in high school, I just saw the story because it was in the local paper where I grew up on the website. The music teacher retired, and I was in his music class, and I wanted to be in the school show. And he said I could be in the show as long as I was stood in the back behind everyone else who was singing, and I only mouthed the words. I didn't actually sing. So that's how tone deaf I am. But yeah, he found a way to include me. There we go. But he was reinforced. I'm like, I'm sixth grade, 11th grade. I still can't sing. So I haven't tried.
Here is to designing an education system where everybody gets to try the things that they are passionate about, that they are wanting to experiment with, and a system that really leans into people's strengths and it is a system that provokes joy for all kids,
Right.
not something that is dreaded. Everyone, we will link everything we talked about for you today in the show notes, and we will see you next week.
It's your turn to join the conversation by sharing what you enjoyed or what questions you have. In a world where time and attention are so valuable, thank you for choosing to listen and for being a part of our Designing Schools community. Leaving a review for the podcast helps others learn about the show, giving them the gift of knowledge and allowing this community to help create access and exposure to ideas and opportunities others may not even know exist.